Picture this scene. A 16-year-old girl, adorned in her finest garments, trembles in the temple's antechamber. Her parents have prepared her for weeks, explaining that this is an honor, a blessing from the gods. But in her eyes, you can read pure terror. For before she can marry the man she loves, an ancient tradition demands she spend this night with the high priest of the temple. This practice disgusts you. It should. For thousands of years, this tradition shaped the destiny of millions of women across the world. From the depths of Mesopotamia to European castles, from the temples of Babylon to Christian monasteries, this barbaric custom crossed civilizations like a curse. So where are you listening to this story from? Comfortably settled at home, far from these horrors, or perhaps on public transport, trying to escape your daily routine. No matter where you are, prepare to dive into one of humanity's darkest chapters. Today, we're going to explore this tradition that haunted our ancestors. This practice they called the rite of the first night, the jus primae noctis, or more crudely, the droit de cuissage, a custom so widespread that it left traces in all ancient and medieval civilizations. If this story fascinates you as much as it disturbs you, subscribe now, because we're going to travel back in time together, cross the centuries, and discover how this barbaric tradition became so deeply rooted in the human soul that it survived for millennia. But that wasn't the whole story. To understand this tradition, we must return to the very sources of civilization. In the fertile plains of Mesopotamia, more than 4,000 years ago, stood Babylon, that legendary city that fascinated the ancient world. At the heart of the city towered a gigantic temple dedicated to Ishtar, the goddess of love and fertility. And it was there, within those sacred walls, that everything began. For the Babylonians had developed a religious system of disturbing sophistication, where sexuality was inseparable from the divine. The Greek historian Herodotus, who visited Babylon in the 5th century before our era, left us a chilling testimony of this practice. The Babylonians have a most shameful law. Every woman born in the country is obliged, once in her life, to go to the temple of Aphrodite and surrender herself to a stranger. Visualize the scene. Hundreds of women seated in the sacred temple precinct, waiting for a man to throw a coin into their lap. Rich or poor, noble or commoner, all were subjected to this merciless law. The wealthiest could have themselves carried in covered chariots, maintaining an appearance of dignity. But the others sat on the bare ground, a crown of strings around their heads to signal their availability. Herodotus continues his account with clinical precision. It is forbidden to refuse the money, whatever the sum, for this money becomes sacred. The woman follows the first one, who throws money to her, and she cannot repel anyone. Once the act was accomplished within the temple grounds, she was freed from her religious obligation, but the trauma marked her life forever. This practice wasn't anecdotal. It constituted the very foundation of Babylonian religion. For Ishtar, this goddess of 1,000 faces, was considered the great celestial prostitute. In the hymns dedicated to her, she boasted of her sexual power. 7 to her belly, 7 to her loins, 60 and 60 can enjoy her sex. The young men are exhausted, but Ishtar will not be exhausted. Ishtar's priestesses, called hierodules, embodied this divinity on earth. They were organized in a complex hierarchy, from simple, sacred prostitutes to high priestesses who slept with kings during sacred marriage ceremonies. For yes, even the most powerful sovereigns had to submit to these rituals. Every year, during the Babylonian New Year festivals. The king had to unite with Ishtar's high priestess in the sacred chamber atop the ziggurat. This act wasn't merely symbolic. It guaranteed the fertility of the lands, the prosperity of the kingdom, and the legitimacy of royal power. Without this carnal union with the goddess's representative, the king lost his connection with the divine. But this system concealed an even more disturbing reality. Behind these rituals lay an organized commerce of female sexuality. Ishtar's temples were true economic enterprises, managing hundreds of women, collecting offerings from the faithful, and redistributing wealth according to complex rules. This Babylonian tradition spread like wildfire throughout the ancient Near East. In Phoenicia, Syria, Armenia, wherever Mesopotamian influence was felt, similar temples arose, perpetuating these practices. The Greek historian Strabo reported that in Corinth, on the Acrocorinth, in Aphrodite's temple, 1,000 slave prostitutes served, offered by the citizens themselves. Before departing for the Olympic Games of 464 BC, Xenophon of Corinth vowed to the goddess to offer her 50 courtesans to serve in her temple on the Acrocorinth if he won. He won 3 crowns at the games and kept his promise. But the story doesn't end there. This barbaric custom would soon take even more sinister forms. When the first Christian communities established themselves in Europe, they discovered a continent already steeped in ritual sexual traditions. The Celts, Germans, and Nordic peoples all possessed their own versions of these ancestral customs. But rather than abolish these practices, the nascent church chose a more perverse strategy to recover them for its own benefit. For the first Christian priests weren't the celibate men we know today. They were married, had children, and above all, they coveted the privileges their religious position offered them. It was in this context that the European version of the rite of the first night was born. No need for pagan temples or oriental goddesses. Christian priests directly arrogated this privilege to themselves, presenting themselves as the necessary intermediaries between God and the faithful. The process was disarmingly simple. When a peasant couple wished to marry, they first had to obtain the blessing of the local priest. He would agree, in exchange for certain services from the bride-to-be. For how better to ensure divine blessing than through intimate union with God's representative on earth? This practice became so entrenched that it acquired its own terminology. In medieval Latin, it was called jus primae noctis, the rite of the first night. In France, droit de cuissage, a crude reference to the act itself. In England, prima nocta. Each region developed its own variations, but the fundamental principle remained the same. The Catholic Church officially condemned these practices, but unofficially it turned a blind eye. Why? Because these traditions generated considerable revenue. Peasants could buy back their wives' purity by paying substantial sums to the church. This tax, called cullage or foremarriage, filled ecclesiastical coffers while maintaining the fiction of moral rectitude. Documents from the 13th century reveal the cynical organization of this system. In the Abbey of Mont Saint-Michel's cartulary from 1247, we find detailed lists of the rights claimed by religious lords. Among them, explicitly mentioned, is the right to the first night with peasant wives. The text is clear. Sir, I tell you, in good faith, it happened in the past that the peasant took his daughter by the hand and delivered her to his lord to do with her as he wished. But it was in Scotland that this tradition reached its most institutionalized form. King Malcolm III, in the 11th century, officially codified what Scottish law called merchet, a tax payable for the right to marry. But behind this administrative terminology hid a much darker reality. Scottish chronicles report that before Malcolm III's reign, under the legendary King Evenus III, every Scottish bride had to spend her wedding night with her lord before joining her husband. The practice was so common it was considered a divine right of the nobility. This wasn't merely an abuse of power, it was a deliberate system of genetic control. The lords believed that by taking the first night, they improved the peasant lineage with their noble blood. Children born from these unions were considered blessed, carrying within them both peasant endurance and aristocratic refinement. The psychological impact on medieval society was devastating. Young brides lived in terror of their wedding night. Some preferred to remain unmarried rather than submit to this humiliation. Others fled to distant lands, abandoning everything to escape their fate. But the lords had thought of everything. Escape attempts were severely punished. A bride who refused to submit to the rite of the first night could see her entire family banished, their goods confiscated, their lives ruined. The system was designed to make resistance impossible. Yet resistance existed. Medieval chronicles speak of young men who preferred to die rather than allow their brides to be dishonored. Epic ballads tell of heroes who challenged their lords in single combat for their wives' honor. But these were rare exceptions in a world where might made right. The practice became so normalized that it was integrated into wedding ceremonies themselves. The priest who blessed the union often claimed his right immediately after the religious ceremony. The wedding feast would continue while the bride disappeared into the priest's chambers. The husband would wait, powerless, for his wife's return. But this was just the beginning of the horror. As we enter the High Middle Ages, what had been religious custom transformed into feudal law. The great lords of Europe, inspired by ecclesiastical practices, decided to formalize their own version of the rite of the first night. The feudal system, with its rigid hierarchy and absolute property rights, provided the perfect framework for institutionalizing this barbaric tradition. Serfs weren't just bound to the land. They and their families belonged entirely to their lord. And what belongs to the lord could be used as the lord saw fit. In France, under the Capetian dynasty, this practice became so commonplace that legal scholars began codifying it. The Coutume Dolores, one of the first French legal codes, explicitly mentions the lord's right to the first night of his serfs' wives. The text, dating from the 12th century, states, without ambiguity, the lord has the right to lie with the wife of his serf on the first night of her marriage. But it was in the Holy Roman Empire that this tradition reached its most systematic form. German chronicles from the 13th century describe elaborate ceremonies surrounding the exercise of this rite. The lord would hold court on the wedding day, and all newly married couples had to present themselves before him. He would then choose which brides would honor him with their first night. These ceremonies weren't private affairs. They took place before the entire community, transforming individual humiliation into collective spectacle. The chosen brides would be led in procession to the castle, while musicians played and courtiers celebrated. What should have been the happiest day of their lives became a public nightmare. The economic aspects of this system were equally cynical. Lords who didn't wish to exercise their right personally could sell it to the highest bidder. Wealthy peasants could buy back their wives' purity, while the poor had no choice but to submit. This created a two-tiered system where money could buy dignity, but only for those who possessed it. Italian city-states developed their own variations of the practice. In Venice, the merchant nobles claimed the right of the first night over the daughters of their servants and employees. Account books from the 14th century show regular payments made to redeem the honor of brides, proving the systematic nature of this exploitation. The Spanish Reconquista added another layer of complexity to these traditions. Christian lords conquering Muslim territories claimed not only land and goods, but also the right to the first night with all women in their new domains. This wasn't just feudal oppression, it was ethnic and religious humiliation designed to break the spirit of conquered populations. But perhaps nowhere was this system more cruel than in England under Norman rule. The Domesday Book, that great census of English wealth compiled by William the Conqueror, doesn't just list lands and livestock. Between the lines, historians have found references to the customs that came with territorial possession, including explicit mentions of sexual rights over the local population. English chronicles tell of Norman lords who made the exercise of this right a celebration of their domination. They would invite fellow nobles to witness the act, turning individual tragedy into collective entertainment. Some even kept detailed records of the women they had possessed, like hunting trophies. The psychological warfare aspect of this practice cannot be understated. By claiming the first night, lords weren't just satisfying their lust, they were demonstrating their absolute power over their subjects' most intimate lives. They were showing that nothing was private, nothing was sacred, nothing belonged to the serfs, not even their wives' bodies. The church, which should have opposed these practices, instead found ways to profit from them. Priests sold indulgences to lords who wished to exercise their right without sinning. They blessed these unions as sacred acts that brought the community closer to God. The corruption was complete. Women developed their own strategies of resistance. Some married very young, before reaching physical maturity, hoping to delay the fateful moment. Others feigned illness or madness on their wedding day. The most desperate chose death over dishonor, leaving behind broken families and traumatized communities. Yet the system persisted because it served multiple functions. For the lords, it was a demonstration of power and a source of genetic diversity. For the church, it was a source of revenue through redemption payments. For the legal system, it was a tool of control that kept populations submissive. But beneath the surface, something was changing. While Europe grappled with its feudal version of the right of the first night, similar practices flourished across the globe, proving that this barbaric tradition transcended cultural boundaries. From the Islamic world to ancient Asia, from African kingdoms to pre-Columbian America, the pattern repeated itself with disturbing consistency. In the Islamic caliphates, despite the Quran's emphasis on marital fidelity, powerful emirs and sultans found ways to circumvent religious law. They would claim the right of temporary marriage with newlywed women, using Islamic jurisprudence to legitimize what was essentially legalized assault. The practice, known as nikah mata, allowed powerful men to marry women for periods as short as a single night. The Ottoman Empire institutionalized this through the devshirme system. While primarily known for recruiting Christian boys for the Janissary Corps, lesser-known records reveal that Ottoman officials also claimed rights over Christian brides in newly conquered territories. This wasn't just military conquest, it was cultural annihilation through intimate violation. In India, the caste system provided its own framework for this practice. High caste Brahmins claimed divine right to the first night of lower caste brides. They justified this through religious texts that described the purification of lower castes through union with the spiritually pure. Temple inscriptions from the Chola period explicitly mention these purification rituals. The practice became so embedded in Indian society that it generated its own mythology. Stories tell of brave warriors who challenged Brahmin priests to single combat for their wives' honor. Epic poems describe the tears of brides forced to choose between family survival and personal dignity. Yet for every story of resistance, there were thousands of silent submissions. Chinese imperial records reveal similar patterns during various dynasties. Local magistrates and provincial governors claimed the right to inspect new brides for spiritual purity. This thinly veiled excuse allowed corrupt officials to satisfy their desires while maintaining the facade of bureaucratic duty. The practice became so widespread that it contributed to several peasant rebellions, including elements of the Taiping Rebellion. In feudal Japan, the daimyo lords claimed similar rights over their subjects. The practice, known as Hatsuyoru no Ken, rite of the first night, was justified through Shinto beliefs about spiritual purification through contact with divine authority. Samurai codes of honor theoretically protected against such abuses, but in practice, the rigid hierarchy made resistance impossible. African kingdoms developed their own variations of this tradition. In the kingdom of Baganda, the Kabaka king claimed the right to the first night of any woman in his realm. This wasn't seen as abuse, but as divine blessing. Women chosen by the Kabaka were considered blessed by the gods, and their children held special status in society. The Ashanti Empire in present-day Ghana had similar customs. The Asanahin could claim any woman in his territory for ceremonial purposes. These unions were seen as sacred marriages that connected the earthly realm with the spiritual world. The complexity of these beliefs made it difficult for British colonial authorities to suppress the practice. Even more disturbing were the practices in pre-Columbian America. Aztec priests claimed the right to consecrate new brides through ritual union before they could marry their chosen partners. These ceremonies took place atop temple pyramids, with the entire community watching from below. The psychological impact on both the women and their future husbands was devastating. High priests of the sun god, Inti, claimed divine right to the first night of chosen women. These women, known as chosen women or virgins of the sun, were often selected in childhood and prepared for years for this fate. What makes these global patterns even more disturbing is how they evolved independently in societies with no contact with each other. This suggests that the rite of the first night was unintended just a historical aberration, but a recurring expression of power dynamics that seem almost inherent to hierarchical societies. The common elements across cultures are chilling in their consistency. Religious or spiritual justification, economic compensation systems, community complicity, and the complete powerlessness of the victims. Whether justified by divine right, feudal law, caste purity, or spiritual blessing, the result was always the same: the systematic exploitation of women at their most vulnerable moment. Trade routes and cultural exchange sometimes blended these traditions. Silk Road merchants carried stories of practices from one culture to another, leading to hybrid forms that combined elements from different traditions. The result was an even more elaborate system of control and exploitation. But perhaps most disturbing was how these practices shaped the psychology of entire civilizations. Children grew up knowing that their future wives or husbands would face this ordeal. Young people learned to expect it, plan around it, accept it as natural. The normalization of such extreme violation created societies where consent itself became a foreign concept. Yet, within this darkness, seeds of change were beginning to sprout. To truly understand how the rite of the first night persisted across millennia and cultures, this wasn't simply brute force. It was a complex system of control that operated on multiple levels of society. The first mechanism was the normalization of hierarchy. In societies where the rite of the first night existed, social stratification wasn't just accepted. It was considered divinely ordained. People weren't born equal. They were born into predetermined roles that defined every aspect of their existence. The lord's right to a peasant's wife was no different from his right to their labor or their land. Religious institutions played a crucial role in this normalization. Priests and religious scholars developed elaborate theological justifications for the practice. In Christian contexts, they argued that the Lord, as God's representative on earth, was purifying the union through his divine touch. Islamic scholars used similar logic with temporary marriage contracts. Hindu Brahmins claimed they were elevating lower castes through spiritual contact. The economic dimension created another layer of control. The ability to buy back a wife's purity with money meant that the practice became a tax on dignity. Those who could afford it paid, those who couldn't submitted. This created a psychological division within communities. Some were worthy of protection, others were disposable. Children were conditioned from birth to accept these realities. Little boys learned that their future wives would belong to others first. This early conditioning made resistance feel not just dangerous, but unnatural. The role of women in perpetuating the system was particularly tragic. Mothers who had endured the practice often became its enforcers, preparing their daughters for what they saw as inevitable. Older women in communities would shame those who resisted, arguing that they were bringing disaster on their families. The victims became the guardians of their own oppression. Community complicity was perhaps the most effective control mechanism. The rite of the first night wasn't exercised in secret. It was a public ritual that implicated everyone. Neighbors, friends, and relatives all participated in the ceremony that delivered the bride to her fate. This shared responsibility made individual resistance feel like betrayal of the entire community. The timing of the practice was psychologically devastating. By claiming the first night, the powerful struck at the moment of greatest vulnerability and hope. A woman's wedding day should have been her triumph, the beginning of her new life. Instead, it became her deepest humiliation. This timing wasn't accidental. It was designed to break the spirit completely. The practice also served to emasculate the men in subject populations. Husbands who couldn't protect their wives on their wedding night were reminded of their powerlessness in the most intimate way possible. This psychological castration extended beyond the bedroom into all aspects of life, creating populations of men who had internalized their own subjugation. Communities were filled with stories of what happened to those who resisted. Tales of families destroyed, villages burned, lives ruined. These stories, whether true or exaggerated, created an atmosphere of terror that made submission seem like the only rational choice. In societies where the rite of the first night was codified, resistance became not just dangerous, but illegal. Courts would punish those who interfered with their lord's rights. The law itself became an instrument of oppression. making injustice appear legitimate. Cooperation could bring, while demonstrating the consequences of resistance through contrast. The practice created its own self-reinforcing cycle. Children born from these unions often became intermediaries between the ruling class and the peasantry. Neither fully accepted by either group, they had incentives to maintain the system that created them. They became living symbols of the Lord's power while serving as agents of control within their communities. Women who had been chosen by lords sometimes gained elevated status within their communities. Medical knowledge was weaponized to support the practice. Court physicians would declare that union with nobility improved peasant bloodlines, making children healthier and more intelligent. These pseudoscientific justifications gave intellectual respectability to what was simply systematic exploitation. The calendar itself became a tool of control. Wedding seasons were regulated to coincide with lords' availability. Young couples couldn't marry when they chose, but had to wait for their lord's pleasure. This control over timing extended the psychological pressure over months or even years. Record-keeping served both practical and psychological purposes. Lords maintained detailed accounts of which women they had claimed, creating a kind of trophy system that motivated competition among the nobility while terrorizing subject populations. These records also served legal functions, establishing precedents and property rights. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of the system was how it corrupted the concept of love itself. In societies where the right of the first night existed, romantic love became a dangerous luxury. Couples learned to guard their emotions, knowing that deep attachment would only make the inevitable violation more painful. Yet even within this system of total control, human nature found ways to resist. Despite the overwhelming power of the system, human dignity never entirely surrendered to the right of the first night. Throughout history, brave individuals and communities found ways to resist, creating legends that inspired future generations and ultimately contributed to the tradition's eventual decline. In medieval Scotland, the Ballad of Bold Robin and the Bishop's Bride tells of a young archer who challenged a corrupt bishop's claim to his beloved. According to the song, Robin waited hidden in the bishop's chambers, and when the cleric arrived to claim his right, the archer's arrow found its mark. The ballad spread throughout the Highlands, inspiring similar acts of defiance. French chronicles record the story of Marguerite de Bourbon, a peasant woman who organized the women of her village in 1347. When their lord demanded his customary rights, the women appeared en masse at his castle, each carrying a knife. They declared that any man who wished to claim the right of the first night would find it would be his last night on earth. The lord, faced with this unprecedented collective resistance, abandoned his claims. In the Germanic territories, the tale of Klaus the blacksmith became legendary. When his bride was claimed by the local count, Klaus appeared at the castle gate in full armor he had forged himself. He challenged the count to single combat, declaring that if God favored justice, the righteous would prevail. The chronicle states that Klaus emerged victorious, though he and his bride had to flee to distant lands to escape retribution. Italian city-states witnessed some of the most sophisticated resistance movements. In 14th century Florence, a guild of artisans developed an elaborate system of false identities and substitute brides. When a nobleman claimed his rights, he would unknowingly spend the night with a prostitute while the real bride escaped to safety. The scheme worked for years before being discovered, saving hundreds of women from violation. The most dramatic resistance came from Ireland, where the practice had been imposed by Anglo-Norman lords. The Night of the Red Wedding in 1169 saw coordinated uprisings across several counties. Irish warriors, painted with war dyes, simultaneously attacked Norman castles during wedding celebrations. While many died in the fighting, the psychological impact was enormous, and several lords abandoned the practice entirely. Women developed their own forms of resistance, often more subtle but equally effective. Records from monastery libraries describe various methods used to avoid the rite of the first night. Some women would induce temporary illness with herbal concoctions. Others would claim to be menstruating, knowing that most lords would postpone the encounter rather than risk religious contamination. The false wedding strategy became particularly popular in England. Couples would hold a secret ceremony months before the official one, consummating their marriage in private. By the time the lord claimed his right, the bride was already pregnant, making the union less appealing to many nobles who preferred virgins. While risky, this approach saved many families from the worst humiliation. Religious resistance sometimes came from unexpected quarters. In Spain, several Dominican friars were secretly helping couples escape to monasteries where they could claim sanctuary. These priests, working against their own church's interests, created underground networks that smuggled brides to safety. When discovered, they faced severe punishment, but their martyrdom inspired others. The merchant classes developed economic resistance strategies. Wealthy traders would collectively buy the rights to all marriages in their communities, then simply never exercise them. This financial approach proved effective in Italian city-states and German trading towns. Though it required substantial collective wealth, perhaps the most creative resistance came from the Ottoman territories. Christian communities developed elaborate theatrical performances that mocked the practice while appearing to comply. They would stage fake ceremonies where actors played the parts of compliant brides and lustful officials, while the real ceremonies took place in secret. These performances became so popular they evolved into folk traditions that survived long after the original practice ended. Children born from the rite of the first night sometimes became the most effective resistors. Having seen firsthand the trauma inflicted on their mothers, some dedicated their lives to ending the practice. Records suggest that several successful peasant rebellions were led by such individuals, who combined intimate knowledge of the system with deep personal motivation for change. The printing press became an unexpected ally to resistance movements. Pamphlets describing the sufferings caused by the rite of the first night circulated throughout Europe, creating the first continental awareness of the practice. These early forms of journalism exposed the hypocrisy of claiming divine justification for systematic assault. Resistance wasn't always violent or dramatic. Sometimes it took the form of simple non-compliance. Entire communities would simply stop acknowledging the rite, continuing with their weddings, as if the tradition had never existed. When lords attempted to enforce their claims, they would find empty villages or communities that had mysteriously forgotten how to locate the relevant brides. The role of reformed clergy became crucial in later centuries. Priests who had experienced genuine religious conversion began refusing to cooperate with the practice. They would perform marriages without notifying secular lords or would help couples escape to jurisdictions where the practice wasn't recognized. This clerical resistance was particularly effective because it removed the religious justification that had supported the system. Women's networks proved remarkably sophisticated in organizing resistance. Through seemingly innocent activities like market gatherings, religious festivals, and craft circles, women shared information about sympathetic priests, safe havens, and effective resistance strategies. These networks operated across vast distances, creating a continental intelligence system that supported local resistance efforts. Some communities developed legal strategies, challenging the practice in courts by questioning its scriptural basis or feudal legitimacy, while most courts initially supported the Lord's rights. Persistent legal challenges gradually eroded the intellectual foundations of the practice. This intellectual resistance was particularly effective in university towns where scholars could provide theological and legal arguments against the tradition. The economic changes of the late medieval period also supported resistance. As trade increased and money became more important than land, lords found it more profitable to collect cash payments than to exercise their rights directly. This commercialization of the practice, while still exploitative, at least gave more families the option to protect their daughters. International marriages between nobility began to create diplomatic pressure against the practice. Queens and princesses from countries where the tradition did not exist would refuse to accept it in their new homes. This high-level resistance gradually made the practice seem barbaric, even to those who had previously accepted it. But the most powerful resistance came from the gradual recognition that the practice was undermining the very foundations of society it claimed to support. By the dawn of the Renaissance, the rite of the first night was facing unprecedented challenges from multiple directions. The forces that had sustained it for millennia were beginning to crumble, and a new understanding of human dignity was emerging that would ultimately prove incompatible with such barbaric traditions. The Protestant Reformation dealt one of the first serious blows to the practice. Martin Luther and other reformers, in their zeal to purify Christianity from what they saw as Catholic corruptions, explicitly condemned the rite of the first night as an abomination that had no basis in Scripture. Protestant territories began formally abolishing the practice, creating refugee destinations for those fleeing Catholic lands where it persisted. John Calvin went even further, declaring that any ruler who claimed such rights was acting as an agent of Satan rather than God. His theological arguments provided intellectual ammunition for those challenging the practice throughout Europe. Calvinist communities became centers of resistance, offering sanctuary to those fleeing the tradition. The Renaissance itself, with its emphasis on human dignity and individual worth, created an intellectual climate hostile to the rite of the first night. Humanist scholars, like Erasmus, wrote eloquently about the inherent worth of all people, regardless of birth or station. These ideas, while initially confined to educated elites, gradually filtered down through society. The printing press accelerated this intellectual transformation. Books, pamphlets, and broadsheets describing the horrors of the practice circulated throughout Europe. Personal accounts from victims and their families humanized the issue in ways that abstract moral arguments could not. Public opinion began to shift as people realized the full extent of the suffering the tradition caused. Economic changes also undermined the practice. The rise of merchant capitalism created new forms of wealth and power that didn't depend on feudal hierarchies. Successful merchants could buy their way out of feudal obligations entirely, including the rite of the first night. More importantly, they could sponsor resistance movements and provide economic alternatives to feudal dependency. The discovery of the New World created new possibilities for escape. Thousands of families fled to the Americas specifically to avoid the right of the first night and other feudal impositions. Colonial records from the 16th and 17th centuries are filled with immigrants who cited escape from sexual oppression as their primary motivation for leaving Europe. Legal challenges became more sophisticated and effective. University-trained lawyers began arguing that the right of the first night violated natural law principles that transcended local custom. These arguments found increasingly sympathetic audiences in courts influenced by Renaissance legal scholarship. Precedent-setting cases began to establish that consent was required for any sexual union, regardless of social status. The Catholic Counter-Reformation, while primarily focused on other issues, also contributed to the practice's decline. Reform-minded bishops, seeking to improve the Church's moral reputation, began cracking down on clerical participation in the tradition. Priests who cooperated with secular lords in exercising the right of the first night faced censure and removal from office. International diplomacy played an unexpected role in the tradition's decline. As European powers expanded their overseas empires, they became more conscious of their international reputation. Foreign ambassadors and traders reported back to their home countries about the barbaric practices they witnessed in Europe. This international embarrassment motivated some rulers to abandon traditions that made them appear uncivilized. The scientific revolution contributed by undermining the pseudo-medical justifications for the practice. As anatomical knowledge improved and medical practice became more sophisticated, the claims about improving bloodlines through noble intervention became obviously false. Medical professionals began speaking out against practices they now recognized as harmful rather than beneficial. Women's increasing literacy played a crucial role in resistance. As more women learned to read and write, they could document their experiences and communicate with others facing similar situations. Personal letters and diaries from this period reveal extensive networks of support and information sharing among women across Europe. The 30 Years' War, while devastating in many ways, also disrupted traditional feudal structures. Many noble families were ruined or displaced, breaking the chains of custom that had bound peasant communities for centuries. When new authorities emerged after the war, they often lacked the traditional legitimacy needed to reimpose such deeply personal forms of control. Philosophical developments during the Enlightenment provided the final intellectual blow to the practice. Thinkers like John Locke argued that individual rights were inherent and inalienable, not subject to the whims of rulers. These ideas, combined with new concepts of social contracts and popular sovereignty, made traditions like the right of the first night appear as violations of fundamental human rights. The practice's decline wasn't uniform across Europe. It persisted longest in the most isolated and traditional areas, particularly in mountainous regions where feudal structures remained strong. Some lords attempted to maintain their rights through increasingly elaborate ceremonies and justifications. But these efforts only highlighted the anachronistic nature of the tradition. By the 18th century, the right of the first night had largely disappeared from Western Europe, though isolated cases continued to be reported well into the 19th century. The Industrial Revolution delivered the final blow by creating new economic relationships that made feudal obligations irrelevant. Workers could sell their labor to the highest bidder rather than remain bound to particular lords or lands. The The French Revolution symbolically ended the tradition in continental Europe. The Declaration of the Rights of Man explicitly guaranteed individual liberty and dignity, making practices like the rite of the first night not just immoral but illegal. Revolutionary tribunals prosecuted former nobles who had exercised these rights, and several were executed specifically for sexual crimes against their former subjects. Napoleon's legal reforms codified these changes across his empire. The Napoleonic Code explicitly protected marital rights and made sexual coercion illegal regardless of social status. As Napoleon's influence spread across Europe, these legal protections followed, creating a continent-wide prohibition on the practice. The rite of the first night had become associated with the bad old days of feudalism and religious superstition. Modern progressive rulers wanted to distance themselves from such barbaric traditions. The final death blow came from an unexpected source: Romanticism. The 19th century's cult of romantic love made the idea of forced sexual relationships deeply offensive to popular sensibilities, literature, poetry, and art, making traditions like the rite of the first night appear not just immoral but aesthetically revolting. Yet, even as the practice disappeared from Europe, its legacy lingered in other forms. While Western Europe was abandoning the rite of the first night, the practice continued to thrive in many parts of the world well into the modern era. Colonial administrators, missionaries, and travelers documented numerous variations of the tradition across Africa, Asia, and the Americas, revealing that this barbaric custom was far more widespread and persistent than Europeans had imagined. In the Ottoman Empire, the practice persisted in various forms until the empire's collapse. After World War I, Turkish officials continued to claim rights over Christian and minority populations, justifying it through religious law and administrative necessity. British diplomatic records from the 19th century describe systematic abuses in Ottoman territories, where local governors treated entire populations as their personal property. The British Raj in India encountered numerous local variations of the practice. Hindu princely states maintained elaborate harems, where newly married women from subject populations were required to serve before returning to their husbands. British officials, while officially condemning the practice, often turned a blind eye to maintain political stability with local rulers. The caste system provided its own justification for these practices. Brahmin priests continued to claim purification rights over lower caste brides well into the 20th century. Detailed records from the British colonial administration document thousands of cases where Indian women were forced into temporary unions with religious authorities before their marriages could be recognized. African kingdoms maintained their own versions of the tradition, even as synoptic European colonization disrupted traditional power structures. The Kingdom of Baganda continued the practice until British rule was firmly established in the 1890s. The last recorded case of a kabaka claiming the right of the first night occurred in 1888. Involving over 30 young brides in a mass ceremony. In the Americas, isolated communities in mountainous regions of South America maintained pre-Columbian traditions well into the 20th century. Anthropologists working in the Andes during the 1920s documented villages where shamans still claimed the right to consecrate new brides through ritual union. These practices were often hidden from government authorities and outsiders. The Russian Empire, despite its Orthodox Christian foundation, maintained versions of the practice in its most remote territories. Siberian governors claimed traditional rights over indigenous populations, justifying it through both imperial authority and orthodox theology. The practice continued until the Russian Revolution abolished all feudal privileges. Perhaps most disturbing was how the tradition evolved and adapted to modern circumstances. In colonial territories, European administrators sometimes adopted local versions of the practice, creating hybrid forms that combined Western legal authority with indigenous custom. These colonial abuses were often covered up or ignored by metropolitan authorities. The Industrial Revolution created new contexts for similar exploitation. Factory owners and mine supervisors in developing regions sometimes claimed sexual privileges over the wives and daughters of their workers. While not technically the right of the first night, these practices showed how economic power could replicate the dynamics of the older tradition. Military conflicts provided cover for the continuation of these practices. During both World Wars, occupying armies sometimes revived ancient traditions in conquered territories, claiming historical precedent for systematic assault. The Nuremberg trials and Tokyo war crimes tribunals documented numerous cases where military commanders had institutionalized such practices. The persistence of the tradition in some Islamic societies took on particularly complex forms. Religious courts in some regions continued to recognize temporary marriage contracts that effectively legalized the right of the first night under religious law. These practices, while condemned by mainstream Islamic scholars, persisted in isolated communities well into the modern era. Communist revolutions in the 20th century officially abolished these practices, but sometimes replaced them with new forms of sexual exploitation. Party officials in some communist countries claimed ideological justification for sexual privileges, arguing that traditional morality was bourgeois superstition that had no place in revolutionary society. The decolonization process of the mid-20th century revealed the proceeding extent to which these traditions had persisted under colonial rule. Independence movements in Africa and Asia uncovered extensive documentation of sexual exploitation by both colonial administrators and traditional rulers. The new governments faced the challenge of abolishing practices that were deeply embedded in local custom while avoiding accusations of cultural imperialism. Modern human rights organizations began documenting survivals of the right of the first night in the 1970s and 1980s. Reports from Afghanistan, parts of rural India, and several African countries described ongoing practices that bore striking resemblances to the historical tradition. These modern survivals were often hidden within cultural or religious ceremonies that made outside intervention difficult. The rise of feminism brought new attention to these historical and contemporary abuses. Women's rights activists began documenting the psychological trauma inflicted by traditions, like the right of the first night, showing how they contributed to broader patterns of gender oppression that persisted even after the specific practices ended. International human rights law eventually provided legal frameworks for addressing these practices. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights and subsequent treaties explicitly prohibited forced sexual relationships, regardless of cultural or religious justification. However, enforcement remained problematic in many regions. The digital age has created new awareness of historical abuses, while also revealing their persistence in modified forms. Social media has allowed survivors and their descendants to share stories that were previously suppressed or ignored. At the same time, human trafficking and forced marriage in some regions show how ancient patterns of sexual exploitation continue in new forms. Contemporary scholars have begun recognizing the rite of the first night as an early form of systematic sexual violence that prefigured modern crimes against humanity. The International Criminal Court now recognizes forced sexual relationships as war crimes and crimes against humanity, providing legal frameworks that would have prohibited historical practices had they existed at the time. Yet the psychological and cultural legacies of these practices continue to influence modern relationships and social structures in many parts of the world. The abolition of the rite of the first night didn't erase its impact on human consciousness. Thousands of years of institutionalized sexual violence left deep psychological scars that continue to influence modern attitudes toward sexuality, marriage, and power relationships. Understanding this legacy helps explain many contemporary social problems that seem to have no obvious historical source. The normalization of sexual violence embedded in the rite of the first night created cultural patterns that persisted long after the practice itself disappeared. In societies where the tradition had been common, domestic violence rates remained elevated for generations. Men who had been raised in cultures where women bodies belonged to whoever held power found it difficult to accept genuine partnership with their wives. Marriage itself was fundamentally altered by this history. The concept of consensual intimacy had to be essentially reinvented in societies emerging from traditions of forced sexual relationships. Wedding nights became sources of anxiety rather than celebration, as both partners struggled with cultural memories of violation and powerlessness. Women's relationship with their own sexuality was particularly damaged. In cultures where the rite of the first night had existed, female sexuality was seen as something that belonged to men rather than to women themselves. This led to persistent patterns of sexual repression, shame, and dysfunction that affected generations of women even after legal equality was achieved. The practice had also created deep psychological divisions between different social classes. Peasant families developed intense distrust of authority figures that persisted long after feudalism ended. This class-based trauma contributed to social revolutions and political upheavals throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. As suppressed rage finally found expression in mass movements, children raised in societies where the rite of the first night existed internalized profoundly disturbed concepts of power and consent. Boys learned that sexual access was a privilege of dominance rather than a gift of love. Girls learned that their bodies were not their own, but belonged to whoever held authority over them. These lessons shaped personality development in ways that influenced entire cultures. The religious dimension of the trauma was particularly complex. In societies where priests had participated in the practice, faith itself became contaminated with associations of sexual exploitation. This religious trauma contributed to the eventual secularization of European society, as people unconsciously rejected institutions associated with historical abuse. Parent-child relationships were distorted by the practice in ways that lasted for generations. Mothers who had endured the rite of the first night often became overprotective of their daughters while simultaneously preparing them for inevitable victimization. This created cycles of anxiety and helplessness that were passed down through families like genetic disorders. The economic aspects of the tradition created lasting distortions in how societies understood the relationship between money and human dignity. The ability to buy back a bride's purity established the principle that human rights were commodities that could be purchased. This commercialization of dignity contributed to the development of prostitution and human trafficking as permanent social institutions. The practice had profound effects on male psychology as well. Men who had been forced to witness or participate in their wives' violation developed complex trauma responses that included both rage and learned helplessness. Some became perpetrators themselves, while others retreated into emotional withdrawal that made genuine intimacy impossible. The collective memory of sexual trauma influenced art, literature, and popular culture for centuries. Fairy tales like Sleeping Beauty and Beauty and the Beast can be read as cultural processing of memories related to forced sexual relationships with powerful authority figures. These stories helped societies work through historical trauma while simultaneously perpetuating some of its psychological patterns. Legal systems were shaped by the historical memory of the right of the first night in complex ways. While modern law explicitly prohibits sexual coercion, many legal traditions retain assumptions about male authority and female submission that originated in eras when such practices were common. Rape laws, marriage laws, and domestic violence statutes all bear traces of this historical influence. The development of romantic love as a cultural ideal can be understood partly as a reaction against the historical reality of the rite of the first night. The elaborate courtship rituals and emphasis on mutual consent that characterized 19th century romance were cultural innovations designed to heal the wounds left by millennia of forced sexual relationships. Modern therapy and psychological treatment have revealed how historical trauma can be transmitted across generations through cultural practices and family dynamics. Children and grandchildren of those who experienced the rite of the first night often displayed symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, despite having no direct experience of the practice themselves. The feminist movement of the 20th century can be understood partly as a response to this historical legacy. Women's demands for bodily autonomy, reproductive rights, and protection from sexual violence were rooted in cultural memories of systematic exploitation that went back thousands of years. The intensity of these struggles reflected the depth of the historical wounds being addressed. Contemporary discussions about consent, sexual autonomy, and gender equality continue to grapple with concepts and assumptions that were shaped by historical practices like the rite of the first night. The difficulty many societies have in fully accepting women's equality reflects deep cultural programming that originated in eras when women's bodies literally belonged to male authority figures. The practice's legacy also helps explain persistent patterns of sexual exploitation in modern institutions. From Hollywood casting couches to corporate harassment, the basic dynamic of using power to coerce sexual compliance echoes the historical rite. Understanding this historical context helps explain why such behavior persists despite legal prohibitions and social condemnation. Educational systems in many countries still struggle with teaching about sexuality and consent in ways that fully acknowledge human dignity and autonomy. This difficulty reflects cultural memories of eras when such concepts would have seemed revolutionary or dangerous. The resistance to comprehensive sex education often stems from unconscious associations between sexual knowledge and historical trauma. But perhaps the most profound legacy of the rite of the first night is how it shaped fundamental concepts of power and authority that continue to influence modern politics and social organization.